Okay, hello everyone and welcome to the first episode in social influence. This lesson is about conformity, but since I start with this module when I'm teaching the Year 12s, I start it off by going through Ash's Lines experiment. And I run the experiment like a real experiment. So I start off by saying, and obviously this is all pretend, I start off by saying that we're going to do an experiment in visual perception. I ask the students to not talk during the experiment, and then I run them through essentially a recreation of Ash's Lines experiment. So I tell them how it works, where they have to match up the stimulus line to the line which matches it in its length, and then vote by... I actually changed this. I got them to vote out loud, but when I had bigger classes, I got people to vote by raising their hands. And then I asked people if they wear glasses to put them on now. This is where I get a student to leave the room to go and look for my non-existent glasses, so then we can have our participant and the rest of us can be Confederates. So I give an example of what the stimulus line there is with A, and then to match it to one of the three comparison lines, and we do a test run, and obviously A matches up with 2. The person has now left the room who's going to go and find my non-existent glasses, and then I give these instructions obviously to the rest of the class to get them to give a correct answer and then 2 incorrect answers to see if the other person will conform. Okay, and I put the slide back up while they come back into the room. And then we run the experiment. So obviously this one they would give the correct answer, this one they would give the incorrect answer, and this one they could give the incorrect answer. Now obviously everyone else in the room knows what's going on, but the other person doesn't, so we need to use some keywords to tell them what we've just been up to with the experiment. Okay, so here's where our first keyword of the module comes in, which is Confederate. A Confederate is an actor who's pretending to be a participant, but they are instructed what to do by the researcher. So in this case, in the replication, I would have instructed the rest of the class of what answers to give, and when to give a correct answer, when to give an incorrect answer. It's exactly what the Confederates in Ash's Lines study had to do. Also, we talk about deception, which is the first introduction to the ethical issues. So deception is sometimes necessary in research, particularly in social psychology. We see it come up time and time again in the social influence module. And I talk through what deception is in terms of lying to participants. And we need to weigh up a cost-benefit analysis. It would be an ethical issue if the benefit did not outweigh the cost, or if the participants were not debriefed after the experiment. Okay, a lot of the times experiments involve some level of either deception in terms of lying or not telling participants the full truth about the experiment until afterwards. Obviously the cost is bigger if the lie is bigger, and then the benefit is what you gain from the research. In this case, the cost-benefit analysis is justified. A small deception that will perhaps cause a little bit of embarrassment to participants is worth it if we can debrief them afterwards and explain what we gained from their embarrassment, which in this case was quite significant. Okay, we also need to debrief participants after the experiment to make sure that everyone, when they leave the research, they know exactly what's happened, how they were deceived, and what the truth of the experiment was. So this brings us on to the lesson title. So this is the first lesson in social influence, and we talk about different types of conformity. We will be defining types and explanations of conformity, and we will make sure that we do not get those 2 keywords mixed up. We also will cover the aim, procedure, findings, and conclusions of Ash's research, and define keywords relevant to Ash's research. So this is quite a nice one because we get a little bit of an introduction to an experiment, to research methods, key terms, and the start of social influence. When we check the spec for social influence, we can see we need to know types of conformity and explanations of conformity. You will notice that they are 2 different things. If we get an exam question on one, we need to know exactly what it's asking us for. Types of conformity are internalisation, identification, and compliance. And then explanations of conformity are informational social influence and normative social influence, which is what this whole lesson is going to be about. So, first up, we need to find out what is conformity. And again, it's another keyword to add to your key term glossary. Conformity is an individual changing their thoughts or behaviour due to real or imagined social pressure. It's important right off the bat that we do not get confused between conformity and obedience. So conformity, changing their thoughts or behaviour due to real or imagined social pressure. We can think about what examples of conformity do you see in school, and why do you think people conform? If you'd like to pause the video to have a go at the test, please pause it now. The one which I think of a lot in terms of conformity at school is the different ways that people wear their ties. This seems to have gone out of fashion a little bit now, but particularly when I was in school, we used to wear our ties in as weird a way as we possibly could, so we would make it really short and fat, and it doesn't look very nice, but everyone used to do it, so everyone used to conform to it. You don't see it as much nowadays. In terms of why people conform, the most obvious answer is conforming to fit in with a group, which we will talk about in today's lesson, but we will also talk about another reason why people might conform. Okay, so we're going to start off by talking about types of conformity, and we will talk about explanations later. So types, basically different categories of conformity. Now we're going to talk about these three different types, and if you're taking notes on this, I would encourage you to be really clear on the fact that we're moving from a very shallow level of conformity here down to a more deeper level of taking on the answer, because that is a question which does come up time and time again in terms of which is a sort of more deeper cognitive process compared to what is a more shallow emotional process. Okay, so we're going to go through these one by one. We're going to start off by talking about the most shallow level, which is compliance. Okay, to comply with something is to just go along with it. An individual going along with the group in order to gain their approval or avoid their disapproval. Basically, trying to fit in. In this case, there's only a change in behaviours that express in public when there's no change that's taken place in private. And an example of this, pretending to like football because your friends like it, but in private you still don't like or watch football. Okay, they just want to fit in with their group of friends who like football, but that doesn't mean they're going to start liking it or watching it. Moving on to identification, so we're now sort of getting into deeper levels of conformity here. So identification is when an individual accepts influence because they want to become part of the group. Okay, they identify with the group. It's not just because they want to fit in, it's because they identify with something to do with the group. Okay, so whether it's, I'll give an example in a moment. After exposure, the individual decides the group are right after all. Essentially, it kind of sits between compliance and internalisation because it begins as just for show. It's just a change in public for the purpose of being liked and to fit in with a group that they identify with, that ends up with a real change too, so that it leads to a change in private. For example, using a phrase to fit in because your friends use it, but then the phrase becomes part of the way you speak even when you're away from the group. And then internalisation is the deeper level of conformity. There is now no difference between public and private beliefs. After exposure to the group's views, the individual decides the group are right, so they change their opinion in public and in private. The group's views cause a permanent change that is maintained both in public and private. There's no pretending involved. There's no difference in public and private beliefs. An example here is going to a house of worship and becoming religious. Okay, so now you have some different examples here. One is compliance, one is identification, one is internalisation. Please pause the video here and see if you can match them up. And as a challenge, create your own scenario for one of the different types of conformity. Okay, and now going through some answers. Sally likes rock music and dislikes opera. She listens to opera with her friends, then she discovers she likes it. This is identification. She's identifying with her friends, so she's going along with what they think because she identifies with them. And then she decides that they're right. So it begins as a public change, but then turns into a private change too. Saeed dislikes smoking. All of his friends smoke, and when he Saeed dislikes smoking. All of his friends smoke, and he smokes to join in with them. When he is alone, he does not smoke. This is an example of compliance, okay, because we have a public behaviour or a public belief that's not carried over into private. Ryan likes football, but he did not support a specific team. He meets some Chelsea fans and becomes a Chelsea supporter. This is an example of internalisation. Okay, he's not changing his opinion to fit in or because he identifies with the group. He's just met some fans and he decides that they're right. So it is a belief which is changed both in public and in private because he thinks the group are right. Okay, so we've talked about the 3 different types of conformity. We're now going to talk about the 2 explanations of conformity. Okay, so explaining why does conformity take place. Okay, Deutsch and Girard propose that there are 2 reasons why people conform: the need to be liked and the need to be right. Normative social influence. If we think about the word normative, obviously it sounds like the word normal. It's conforming in order to be normal or to be seen as normal. We wish to be liked by the group or conforming to fit in, so the need to be liked. Whereas informational social influence is conforming so that you can gain information. We look to the group for information and conforming to be right. We're now going to talk about these 2 different explanations in detail, and this is where we're going to go back to Ash's research. Okay, the rest of the slides are color-coded, by the way, so the orange slides will be all about normative social influence and the green slides will be about informational. So normative social influence. Pause this here and see if you can fill in the word bank to the word fill. Normative social influence is about norms. What is normal or typical behaviour for a social group? People do not like to appear foolish and prefer to gain social approval rather than being rejected. Ultimately, normative social influence is the need to be liked. And you'll notice here, I've put normative social influence and then put NSI in brackets. Whenever you're writing an answer in an exam, and it's good to get into this practice in your notes as well, you need to write out the key term in full first, and then you can put your abbreviation in brackets, and then for the rest of that answer specifically, you can use this example. Okay, so for example, I've put normative social influence in full first, then I've written NSI in brackets, and then in the rest of my answer, I can continue writing NSI. You have to do this for every answer if you want to use an abbreviation. Okay, so now we're going to look into Ash's lines experiment from 1951. Obviously, since I used this lesson at the start of Year 12, we have to then look at the different parts of the research. So aims are why the experiment was being conducted. What are the researchers trying to investigate? Procedure is talking about how the research was conducted. What did participants have to do? Results, fairly straightforward. It's what they found out. Okay, what were their results? And then conclusions. What can they conclude from their results? Okay, what did they think it means? Okay, I'm not going to play this on this video. I'm just going to signpost you to Crash Course Psychology, which is a YouTube channel. It's episode 38, Social Influence, and it has a talk through of Ash's lines experiment on there, which I highly suggest you go and watch. And you can also search up on YouTube Ash's lines, and it will come up with different video examples showing you how the experiment worked. The research was aiming to investigate the extent to which social pressure from a majority group could affect people to conform. The procedure. Participants sat with 5 Confederates, actors who work with the researcher and pretended to be participants. Participants are told that it's a visual perception experiment. On critical trials, Confederates give the same incorrect answer. Critical trials are the trials which they took the results from. And then the results. Participants gave a wrong answer on the critical trials 36.8% of the time. You don't need to remember specific percentages for these. You can just say a significant amount of the time. 75% of participants conformed at least once. And again, if you're trying to remember this for an exam answer, just say a significant amount of participants conformed at least once. Most participants responded that they conformed to avoid rejection. So when they were asked about why they had given the wrong answer, which as we can see from our example there in the bottom right corner, it will be very obvious that the answer was wrong. So it's not that they're looking for information, it's they're conforming to avoid rejection. They want to fit in. They don't want to go against the group. Which means that this shows normative social influence. Okay, for evaluation, I signpost you to page 19 of the Green Haired Girl book here. But I'm going to also just talk you through these different evaluation points. Okay. So we could talk about demand characteristics as a negative for this experiment. Demand characteristics are characteristics about the experiment that make a participant feel that something is being demanded of them. So they've worked out what it is you're trying to look at, or trying to investigate, or how you think the results are going to go as the researcher. And they feel that something specific is being demanded from them because of this. This can lead to participant reactivity. So participants react in a way that is not their true behaviour because they've worked out what you're asking. In this experiment, it is fairly easy for participants to work out what Ash was doing or what he was investigating. And it's difficult to say whether participants were conforming because they truly wanted to fit in, or whether they were conforming because they wanted to go along with what the researcher wanted. We can also think about cultural relativity here. Okay, so we need to think about how culture's behaviour might change relative to a different culture. This experiment was conducted in America, and we can think about how cultural differences may lead to higher or lower instances of conformity. However, this piece of research is very replicable. This means that it can be repeated very easily. We've even just given an example of how I repeat it in the classroom. It means that we can check the reliability of the results very easily, with reliability meaning consistency of results. It also has very low ecological validity. Okay, so this would be a weakness now. No one else is going to ask you, other than me in a psychology classroom or another researcher, would ask you to judge the lengths of lines and then give your answer out loud. Okay, it's just not a real life task. This is not what conformity looks like in the real world. So we can't take these results and take them outside of the experiment. Okay, it's not true to real life. Okay, I've put these up in bullet points here. So it does have strong scientific method because it has standardized procedures, so easily replicable. It has low modern day relevance because it is conducted in the 1950s, which there were post-war attitudes of working together, so there might be higher conformity there compared to now. It's an artificial task with low ecological validity. Like I said, no one else is going to ask you to judge the length of lines. Ethical issues here in terms of deception and protection from harm. Participants were misled, they were deceived, and they were put in an embarrassing situation which might jeopardize their psychological well-being in terms of being very embarrassing for them. At the same time, we do have to think about the fact that this experiment was conducted before the British Psychological Society guidelines were brought in 1985. Okay. However, they did debrief participants. They did let them know after the experiment what had gone on, and they interviewed them to ask how they felt about it. Okay, and then a reminder there that British Psychological Society guidelines were not introduced until 1985. So we do have to look at the historical context of this research, in that we can't judge them by modern day ideas of what is morally right and morally wrong in research. We can also think about the fact that the BPS guidelines were introduced after a lot of these main pieces of research that we're going to look at in this module, and this is part of what led to these guidelines being introduced. Okay, next up, another gap fill, this time for informational social influence. Pause the video here to have a go at this one. Okay, informational social influence, or ISI, is about who has the better information, you or the rest of the group. You might accept an answer that the group agrees on because you think the answer is correct. Ultimately, it is the need to be right. Now, I've put here, informational social influence happens when the answer is ambiguous. The word ambiguous means there's no clear answer, or there could be several different answers. Okay, it's not clear cut who would be right, so you might look to others for help to work out the situation. Now, I've got two pieces of research here to support informational social influence. Neither of them are key studies, so you can choose which one you would like to use, or you can use both of them. One of them is a bit more straightforward, which is this one here, and then the next one I'm going to talk about is less straightforward, but in my opinion, more interesting. So the first piece of research is Lucas et al. 2006. They asked students to give answers to mathematical problems that were easy or more difficult. They found greater conformity to incorrect answers when the questions were more difficult, when the answer was ambiguous. Okay, so it shows that participants may go along with the group when they're not sure what the true answer is. And then the second piece of supporting research is Sharif in his piece of research, which has been called the autokinetic effect. We can break apart the words here to work out what the study is about. Auto meaning automatic, kinetic meaning movement. The autokinetic effect is a phenomenon of visual perception when a stationary, small point of light in an otherwise dark or featureless environment appears to move. If you've ever looked up at the stars and had to question if you're looking at a still star or a shooting star, this would be why. Okay. Essentially, it's that our eyes struggle to focus on such a small point in our visual field that the muscles which control our eyes start to shake, so it looks like the light's moving backwards and forwards. This was conducted in a lab study. So participants went into a small room and they saw a small spot of light projected onto a screen, and they were asked to rate how much the dot was moving. Obviously the dot was still, but it looked like it was moving because their eyes were becoming fatigued and shaking, and so it looked like the light was moving around. Then they put the participants into groups of 3 and asked them to share their answers aloud. Over numerous trials, the groups converged to a common estimate. And we can see an example of the graph here. Okay, so participant 1 in red, participant 2 in yellow, and participant 3 in green. When they were first asked to estimate alone, they had 3 very different answers. On the second estimate, they shared their ideas together as a group. And we could see the answers immediately conforming together. In the third estimate, they move even closer together, and by the fourth time, they are now, roughly speaking, the same answer. In case they've all decided to agree on the same answer. Oh, there we go, you can see a little bit bigger now. The important part is when they were asked again individually, participants still gave the answer that they'd given within the group. See if you can finish the sentence, this shows that. Okay, in this case, this shows that, or this suggests that, informational social influence has taken place because they have conformed to get to the right answer. When they're giving their answer again individually and they still give the same group answer, it shows that they truly believe the group is right, and that's why they've changed their answer now. Okay. So this in a classroom setting would obviously be a stand-up, sit-down task. So stand up if you think it's true, sit down if you think it's false. We've got some statements here. Okay. All participants in Ash's research were male. This is true. Ash found that a third of participants conformed. Ash concluded that most participants conform to avoid rejection. In Ash's original study, the Confederates sometimes gave the correct response. Okay, these have all been true so far. Ash's study is generalizable to the general population. This is false. Okay, obviously Ash's study was conducted on American men. All of the participants were American males, so it's not possible for us to say that everybody who is a human is going to conform in the same way. Okay. So that is the end of the first lesson in social influence. In the next lesson, we go into variations on Ash's experiment. We will go into that in more detail. Thank you for watching, and I hope this has been helpful. I will see you in the next video.